Hey guys, how's it going? A question that I get a lot from clients is how hard should I go in the gym? Should I train to failure? Should I not train to failure? They read these different workout articles, things like that. So what I'm going to do in this video is share a little bit of science with you. I'm going to look at the outcomes of 3 different studies that looked at training to failure versus not training to failure, and kind of get into the science about it a little bit, and give you some takeaway messages at the end. So hopefully this will help you figure out when to train to failure, when not to train to failure, and the biggest thing is why you're training to failure or not. So without further ado, here we go. Training to failure is a pretty typical approach in bodybuilding circles. The popular thinking is that you need to push your muscles to failure in order to create the tissue damage necessary for the muscle to rebuild itself stronger and bigger. Training to failure is also associated with that coveted pump that you hear the bodybuilders always talking about. It's also associated with a higher level of difficulty and a greater feeling of accomplishment when the session is complete. Despite recent studies that question the necessity of training to failure for muscular adaptations, it still remains a pretty common practice. While this approach remains popular, there is data to suggest that training to failure is not necessary and may actually impact the recovery and could cost you your performance. So the question is, should we train to failure, or should we stop short of failure? And if we stop short of failure, are we impeding our gains because we aren't sufficiently damaging our muscle tissue and stimulating new growth? Well, Moran Navarro et al. In 2017 took a look at the impact on recovery time and the subsequent performance of 10 trained males performing the Smith machine squat and the bench press. They used 3 different protocols, and the weight that was used was based on each participant's 1 rep max. These 3 different protocols were performed by the same 10 males, all performing these exercises after a 4-week break from each of the protocols so that their bodies had time to decondition slightly. The 3 protocols were low volume, not to failure, which was 3 sets of 5 reps, higher volume, not to failure, which was 6 sets of 5 reps, and higher volume to failure, which was 3 sets of 10 reps. These were all at 75% of the 1 rep max for each individual. They measured several different markers of fatigue following the workouts. They also looked at creatine kinase, which is an indirect marker of muscle damage. And they had several different activities that they were performing with low, medium, and high loads that they performed at several different periods following the training sessions to evaluate their recovery. What were found was that there was no significant difference between the low volume not to failure group and the high volume not to failure group in any of the performance measurements following the training at any point, except growth hormone, which was significantly higher in the high volume not to failure group compared to the low volume not to failure group immediately following training only. However, there were many significant differences between the high volume to failure group and the non-failure protocols throughout the 48 hours that they measured after training. The performance of the activities being evaluated were suppressed for 24 to 48 hours in the high volume to failure group compared to both non-failure groups. Also, creatine kinase returned to baseline in 24 hours in the non-failure groups, while it took 48 hours in the high volume failure group. They also looked at ammonia, and it was elevated for 6 hours post-training in the high volume group or to failure group, but not in the other groups. Testosterone response to training followed a similar trend, staying elevated above baseline for the full 72 hours in the high volume to failure group and the high volume not to failure group, while there really was no change at all from baseline in the low volume not to failure group. They also looked at testosterone and cortisol levels, which also follow that similar pattern, except in the higher volume not to failure group compared to the high volume to failure group immediately after training, cortisol was higher in the high volume failure post-training compared to the non-failure at higher volume. So it appears that even when total volume and load is matched, training to failure does have a significant impact on recovery time. But that's only part of the picture. That's looking at recovery time. Now we need to find out if there is any difference in strength and hypertrophy responses in failure versus non-failure. So another study that we can look at to help complete that picture is one that was conducted by Martorelli et al., also in 2017. And this one compared strength and hypertrophy responses in 3 groups of young women performing bicep curls over 10 weeks. Similarly, one group trained to failure, one group trained submaximally with a volume load equated to the failure group, and one group trained submaximally with less volume than the failure group. And a secondary purpose was to examine the muscular endurance responses also between all these groups. What the study found was that hypertrophy increases were statistically similar between the repetitions to failure and the repetitions to failure with matched volume. The repetitions to failure group with less volume did not experience significant hypertrophic gains. Similarly, a study from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research in 2017 found untrained men training only with leg extensions, training not to failure, achieved similar strength and hypertrophy increases compared to participants not training to failure. These studies present compelling evidence to demonstrate that taking every set to failure is not necessary in order to experience gains in muscle size and strength, and actually, this evidence shows that your ability to complete subsequent exercises in a workout session will likely be negatively affected if early session exercises are taken to failure. That being said, failure does have its place in training and should be planned for. Good rules of thumb are to use it on the last set of an isolation exercise when they are the last exercise for a given muscle group. Also, you can use for maximum repetition testing when you have a spotter, and you don't want to use it so you don't want to train to failure in a session within a few days of heavy compound lifting in which you're chasing new personal bests. Okay guys, that was a ton of information in just a few minutes. Hopefully you found it helpful and informative. Take the information and apply it to your workouts when you're building your own programs. If you're not already a subscriber to my channel, please feel free to subscribe. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up, and feel free to drop a comment down in the comment section if you have any feedback or any questions for me. Have a great day.